Okay. Hello, good evening, Dr. Fishman and everyone else here, of course, joining us over Zoom and on Facebook Live. This is, just the day after Yom Kippur. We hope that it went well for everyone and that it was very meaningful. This is the second session of avodah avodah. Exertionary prayer in medieval practice and theory with Dr. Tayla Fishman. And I think, a few notes before we get started. Just the usual people who are coming in, we're going to invite to be panelists. That means that we'll get to see your faces and you'll be able to speak to ask questions when we pause for them. And along with that, it would be great if, we could all stay muted when we're not speaking. And any questions that come up kind of in the interim, you can put into the chat here or into the comments on Facebook Live, and we'll get to them when it's an appropriate time. And now I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Maxine. Gmar Chatima Tova to everybody. I hope Yom Kippur was meaningful. In the previous session, we observed that medieval Jews who reflected on ways of making prayer more efficacious focused not only on the purity of the worshiper's body and the focus of the worshiper's intentions, but also specifically on ways of enhancing communication and connection with God. The exception to the latter, I noted last week, was Maimonides, Rambam, who asserted that by God's very nature, God does not receive prayers, let alone change God's mind. While a passage from Zohar was included among the readings that accompanied the first lecture, other passages were non-Kabbalistic, and we did see there that the quest for God was the central feature. The two medieval phenomena to be considered here are also not Kabbalistic in nature. I stress this to make the larger point that Kabbalists, and enlarging the category mystics, had no monopoly on the quest to experience God more intimately. My own way of distinguishing mystics from Jews who don't consider themselves mystics yet quest for a more immediate experience of God would simply be to say that a mystic strives for this intimacy at all times, while others dedicate specific times to this quest. In fact, when we get to the second phenomenon, a practice of visual contemplation, I would actually argue that the devotees of this practice, the Jewish devotees of this practice, believed that the exertionary pathway they were following was compatible with their rational beliefs. So again, I'm making this case that there's much outside of the realm of Kabbalah per se, and even mysticism, by which I mean the non-sephirotic approach to understanding the relationship of the Creator and the cosmos, that Jews who do not subscribe to that system nonetheless have worked hard to develop ways of feeling God's presence more intimately. Okay, I would like to turn to the first selection, and don't be daunted by all the passages that I've uploaded. I'll talk us through them, and I will, in the interests of time, not read all of them, but will read the most salient points and translate them if they're not translated. Okay, the first case that I want to take up comes from an unusual and very influential medieval compilation called Sefer Hasidim. Sefer Hasidim is a compilation of exempla, meaning these are stories about what a pietist, and I'll define that in a minute, what a pietist does or should do. And the compilation itself is ascribed to the figure of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, Rabbi Judah the Pietist, who lived in the Rhineland between 1150 and 1217. I want to define the word chassid because I think it's often misunderstood. I'm using the English term pietist, and I would love to, when it comes to the Hasidim of the Rhineland called Hasidei Ashkenaz, who were 12th and 13th century pietists, or the Hasidei Habesht, right? The Hasidim whose movement came into being in the late 18th century and which persists today. It would be incorrect to think that a Hasid is someone who is more, quote, religious than another observant Jew or another religious Jew. The Hasid is someone who says, in effect, the law, the halakha, has been given with the average person in mind, someone who's neither really evil nor wholly righteous, but I would prefer to intuit the will of God. So fine, I mean, halakha is cool, but I want to go above and beyond what halakha demands of me. A relevant phrase is lifnim mishurat hadin, right? Which means it's not a translation, but above and beyond what the law requires. And Judaism has had pietists throughout its history. I'll say something that might raise eyebrows, and then if you want to talk about it afterwards, I'm willing to do so. I would say that Jesus of Nazareth was a pietist in many of the things that he said. He said, that is to say, the law says, or the law says, thou shalt not kill, but I say that someone who merely expresses deep anger is already as if he was murderous. Okay, that's the kind of rhetoric that, especially when it's partnered with calls for repentance, that's the kind of language that a pietist, a chassid, would use. Okay, back to our main story. In Sefer Chasidim, we find this very unusual passage, and I'm going to read. I'll read it in Hebrew. I don't know if those who are attending are reading along. I hope so. It says, "Be'ir achat hayu shnei batei knesiot, v'haya ba hachacham la'ir pa'am bazo, pa'am bazo." Right? In one particular city, there were two synagogues, and the chacham, this wise person, sometimes attended one and sometimes the other. V'achar kach lo haya mitpalel ela bakatan. But after he had tried them both out, he decided to only daven at the smaller one. Amru lo, lama azavta hagadol, v'rabim v'nichbadim ba. They said to him, why have you abandoned the big shul where all the important people, where more people and more important people are davening? Amar lahem bakneset hagdola ratzim habrachot v'hatihilot v'tadir me'akvim hatfila ba'anuta aval beit hakneset katan ein kach. He said, because in the big shul, they race through the brachot and the tehillim, and they're always, they're holding up the prayer for other reasons, but this doesn't happen in the small shul. Omrim habrachot v'tishbachot b'meshech. They say the brachot, the blessings and the praises of God in a drawn out fashion. V'ani marviach lakadosh baruch hu kisha'ani moshech. And there's a I'll leave this word marviach untranslated for a minute. I am marviach to God when I draw it out. Okay, we'll come back to that. Ani moneh ba'oto mizmor, kama alefim v'kama beitim, kama kol ot va'ot. I am counting within a particular psalm how many olives there are, how many bets there are, and how many there are of each and every letter. How do I do this? Be'etzba'otai, with my fingers. Va'achar kach, kisha'ani chozer labayit, ani notein ta'am lama kach v'kach. When I get back home, remembering these numbers, how many olives and how many bets, I give reasons explaining why there are these numbers. Okay, this is an unusual passage in which the Chassid basically says, he's called the Chacham here, basically says, when everybody's davening, I'm counting the letters, which suggests it suggests an amazing ability to multitask, to do more than one thing while davening. We'll start with the word marviach. I'm on page 2 now, where I have cited a passage from Echa, from Lamentations 3:56, and the verse is Koli shamata al ta'alem oznecha lerav chati. There's that root, l'shavati, right? You heard my voice, God. Do not hide your ear from my sighing, I would say from my groaning, from my cry, right? Rav chati. So one good meaning of ani marviach is that I'm groaning, I'm sighing to God. But there's also the root revach inside marviach, which means space, to give space, right? To give, to expand. And I would suggest that it's also, at least figuratively, that the Chassid is saying, I am expanding on my words to God by what I do. Now, still, we're not quite sure what he does. If you look at the second 2 passages on page 2, I have cited from let me just give you the dates for Rabbi Yehuda al-Bartzaloni or Yehuda ben Barzilai. Yehuda ben Barzilai is someone from Barcelona, as his name suggests, and he's actually earlier than Hasidei Ashkenaz, and he's living in the Islamicate world. But we know that both in the Islamicate world, right, as well as in the Christian world, there was a known mode of calculation that involved the fingers. So, for example, I would just mention that many North European Jews were involved in viticulture, right? People like Rashi had vineyards, and when you're doing, and some of them rented the land of their vineyards from the church. I know that's a bit amazing, but when you're involved in commerce of any sort or collecting rent, and you don't, you have to be able to make calculations rapidly. And if you look at, I hope this came out well enough. If you look at this unusual table, and I've seen quite a few of them, you see that by positioning the digits of your left and right hand in certain ways, you are actually marking numbers. You'll see here, again, it's not blown up beautifully, but that one can actually count through 9,999 using nothing but the digits of both hands. So, in other words, the thumb has 2 digits, but everything else has 3. And depending on, so you actually can mark these numbers. And this is what the Chassid said he was doing using his hands. Yehuda al-Barceloni says, and I'm jumping in for the 5th word, ki hayodea lechashev be'etzba'ot, yitachen lo lachshov be'eser etzba'ot hayad, yud alafim, right, actually not 10,000, but 9,999, shehem ribo, which is 10,000, echad, uve'eser etzba'ot haregel, this blows me away, you could even use your toes, and in that way you could get up to 10,000, etc. So how one would do that, I have never seen an illustration for that, but it's interesting to note that this is widely known lore. Okay, now we get to, so we understand that this Chassid came up with numbers, how many olives, how many bets. Now, what did he do with it? What the Chassid did with it, we know from a number of other compositions that were produced by Hasidei Ashkenaz, not only Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, but also his foremost student who was quite prolific, who was called Eliezer of Worms, or Rabbi Eliezer Migramaiza, also called Baal HaRokeach, and he has some standing as a mainstream halachist and purveyor of tradition. If Rabbi Yehuda Chassid might be perceived in Sefer Chassidim as a little bit edgy, outliers, that's not the case with the student Rabbi Elazar Baal HaRokeach. And what Rabbi Elazar, so I'm going to now look at a passage that is from his commentary on the Tefillah. Okay, it's quite wild, and I'm going to bring us through it rapidly. Okay, Va'ata echtov lecha keneged ma tiknu yudchet brachot. Now I'm going to tell you what the 18 brachot of Shmona Esrei correspond to. Keneged ma tiknu. Of course, we all know that there are actually 19 brachot, blessings in the Amida prayer, because Vila Malshinim, which was originally called Vila Minim, to the apostates, Vila Minim al tihi tikva, let there be no hope for the apostates. That's the 19th. But he's taking this into account. I'm just going to start and then I'm going to jump. Yudchet kolot b'matan Torah. Evidently, the term kol appears, he claims, 18 times in the biblical portion pertaining to the giving of the Torah. Yud Gimel Kol Hashem, and then another 13. B'matan Torah Yud Gimel Kol Hashem Kol Hey. I blew it. There are 18 times that the word kol is mentioned. 13 with regard to Matan Torah, and then just plain kol, another 5. Hare Yud Zayin. Now we're going to find that the arithmetic doesn't quite work. The echad bekol bakol. It says bakol, not just kol. Hare Yud Chet. Okay. So first of all, he's making the claim, and I'm sure that his count of the number of times the word kol appeared in these places. This is, you're supposed to take this for granted. Okay, va'achad b'mishkan. Okay, and it also says v'yishma ta'kol medaber elav, and then kineged v'la meshumadim yud brachot. So there's another one in another place, and that helps you come up to the number of 19, as in the 19 blessings of the Amida. Okay, next paragraph. Yudchet nikudot lemata. He claims, and I've counted this, it doesn't quite work, that if you count up all the strokes, the pen strokes, underneath the letter Aleph, and also to the side of it, you've got a shuruk at the end, right? Ah, it, a, and then chataf patach. And then you have the shuruk, and that makes 18 below, and one of them above, which is the cholam, and that makes 19. So you get it. He's just looking for 18s. The first one is from the biblical account of Revelation. The second one is from the truth of Masorah. Okay, I'm using that term, right? Masorah meaning the vocalization of the consonantal language of Torah, that there's a meaning to it's not an accident that there are 18 pen strokes. And then he counts 18 festivals, okay, right, 18 days of festival. That's 18, right, Yudchet Moadim, Heim Matzot Zayin, right, 7 days of Pesach, Atzeret, presumably Shmini Atzeret, I think that's what he's talking about, unless it's the Atzeret that we celebrate in diaspora. Rosh Hashanah is 1, interestingly. Yom Kippur is 1, Sukkot is 7, Shmini Atzeret is 1. Harei Yud Chet Min HaTorah, right? The Bible tells us about 18 festivals, and then 1 is known to us from Kabbalah, from received tradition, and that is Purim. Right, no mention of Hanukkah because it's not by any stretch of the imagination in the Tanakh. Okay, and then he comes up with Ketiv v'zeh sha'ar hashamayim, right? That this is the gate of heaven, Mikdash Elyon, the heavenly temple, which is depicted in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 40 onward. Yudchet milim min hatachton. It's 18 miles from the temple which is below it. Okay, that's a rabbinic statement. Okay, all right. I'm just moving on. The menorah has 18 spans, tfachim, 18. Right, Melamed shegova. I'm sorry, that the spans of the height. Melamed shegova hamenorah yudchet tfachim. L'chach, okay, again, it's very granular. And then he goes on to say, Bashidra, that's just before footnote 23, Yeshba Yudchet Chuliot V'achat Ktana Luz Shma, that he claims that in the spine, there are 18 units of vertebrae. I'm not sure that's what he's saying, plus a little one which is called luz. Okay, he's going on and on about this. Yudchet chizukei lev ukvedut, that if you count up all the times that it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened or that it was strengthened, there's 18 of those. Okay, so. And I've cut this off. This is probably 1/3 of the anthology of 18s that appear in this commentary on the Siddur. So what is going on here? What is this all about? I have provided you with somewhat partial English translation of all that. If you now, so this is, I think, what we need to understand. First of all, we know that Hasidei Ashkenaz were omnivorous. They regarded every element of tradition that they had ever come in contact with as authoritative, and that includes Masorah, of course. So there were passages here from Bible, but there were also passages from Chazal, and then from what is known of anatomy at that time, and also the height of the menorah, right? There are other elements that are of which there are 18. Aside from the language, the number of times a certain language appears in the Torah, there are also references to astronomy. Basically, Hasidei Ashkenaz were very conscious of these Rhineland Pietists of the 12th and 13th century. They basically understood that God was in everything, and that in order to try to attain a level of apprehension that would somehow approximate thank you, Atzeret refers to Shavuot. I appreciate the person who just, that was exactly what it refers to. In the count of 18, I was not, I gave a wrong explanation. So what Hasidei Ashkenaz are actually doing, or what Rav Ezra Baal HaRokeach, I'm sorry, Eliezer Baal HaRokeach is doing, is he's trying to take elements, various truths, because they're all true. Nature is true, right? Anatomy is true. Astronomy is true. They're all parts of the truths that God has bestowed alongside revelation. And if one can weave different elements together and find their correspondences, then the devotee who attempts to do this is kind of inching much closer to understanding God's apprehension, which is total, in which everything is related to everything else. In this sense, the pietist who comes up with new, I'm going to use the term weaves again, who weaves new correspondences, a new tissue, I guess I would say, is in some ways discovering new revelations, right? It's there, but the person who engages in this, and quite, it's laborious to first count and then figure out the connections between the numbers. The person who is doing this is striving to become closer to God by acquiring just some kind of, I want to use the Kabbalistic term rashimu, like just the trace of the way that God's omniscience. So this is a very unusual, but very well attested exertionary practice that permeates the writings of Hasidei Ashkenaz. This was a prayer commentary. There are homilies or sermons that are based on similar types of weaves. So I think in the case of this particular exertionary activity, I think it's pretty clear that this is prayer, that the worshiper is using the number as a machine to perceive the connections that bring the worshiper closer to God. Okay, I want to switch now to a very different exertionary practice, one that I think is less well known. You see that on the beginning of page 5. You have an illustration there. And again, I don't know, do you get to see it in color? I printed it and it wasn't in color. Do you see it in color, Maxine? On page 5? All right, well, I do hope you can see this. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Color, yes.
It's a photograph of the frontispiece, the opening pages of a Hebrew Bible codex. And when I say codex, I mean a bound book, a Hebrew Bible codex that was produced in Perpignan in 1299. It turns out that there are almost 25 extant Hebrew Bible codices that are very heavily illuminated. They're ornate. I myself have only ever seen them I've never seen any of them face to face, but I've seen them through their reproductions in the Israeli Institute for Manuscripts. These are remarkable. Some of them are humashim, some of them are actual codices containing the Tanakh. And they're very illuminated, they're ornately decorated with gold and red and green and blue. Let's just say that for those of us who have seen perhaps illuminated Christian manuscripts from the Middle Ages, the Jews have it too, okay? And whereas Christian artists were employed to create stained glass windows and statuary, things that would never fly within Jewish culture, a tremendous amount of aesthetic talent and money was invested in the illustration, the illumination of Hebrew Bible manuscripts or codices of various sorts. Right, Haggadot in particular, but also these codices of Tanakh. Some of you may have seen a Mishneh Torah that was by the Rambam that is heavily illuminated. And the reason that we have, when I say nearly 25, I think it's 23, is because these are luxury items. And so even when all sorts of other intellectual and spiritual riches that were consigned to writing disappeared, the really, really expensive ones did not perdure. I would say, they endured. Most of them are housed in monastery libraries, or in the Bibliothèque Nationale, or in the various, now the national libraries of different European cities. What you see but what is really remarkable about these Hebrew Bible codices, which are called by convention Catalan, I forgot to say that all of them that are extant were produced within a 100-year period in the 13th and 14th centuries, and all of them came from the region of Aragon, Catalonia, and Provence, Provence, of course, being southern France, but bordering Roussillon, bordering this area of Spain, and those three areas were geopolitically, they were one at this time, and certainly Jewish culture of this time is unified for all of them. What makes these Hebrew Bible codices really unusual is that they open with most of the time facing pages, occasionally just one page frontispiece of clay kodesh, of the objects, the sacred objects that were found either in the Mishkan or in the Mikdash. Okay, and I don't want to go into the fine points of that right now. Some have some and some have the other, and there are some small differences. What you're seeing, just in case, I think I didn't bring my, okay. What you're seeing on the right-hand panel, of course, you see in the right upper quadrant, you're seeing the menorah, and you're seeing machatot, things that are used in connection. Sorry, the machateh is not in conjunction with the menorah. You're seeing tongs and another implement whose name I do not remember for lighting the menorah, perhaps. Okay, on the upper left, you're seeing above the 10 Commandments. It actually says in that little space above the 10 Commandments, it says al haparochet, al hakaporet, and then above it you're seeing the kruvim, and it says something about the kruvim whose wings are covering the kaporet. I think that what you're seeing below the menorah in the lower right quadrant of the right-hand page is the shemen, is the urn of oil used. I think there's a mateh to the left. I no longer remember what that plant-like structure is on the right. On the left lower quadrant, you're seeing lechem hapanim, right? The shulchan holding the loaves of bread that were eaten by the families of the Kohanim who were ministering. Okay, and again, it says, and I hope I left out my page where I wrote this out more clearly. It says, "V'zeh ma'aseh hamenorah mikshe zahav ad yirecha and now I'm turning out of the side. Ad pircha mikshehi." It's a citation from scripture that describes the work of the menorah. Okay, and then it says pircha mikshehi kemar'eh asher her'eh Hashem et Moshe. Now kain asat hamenorah uvamnorah arba hagviim mishukadim kaftoreha. Okay, it's a description. It's the biblical description of what the menorah looks like. It's different parts. Okay, moving to the left side of the frontispiece, We are seeing on the upper right quadrant, we're seeing, I think, Mizbeach Hazahav, and you're seeing Chatzotzrot, right, trumpets, and then you see a shofar. That's the upper right quadrant. Below that, you're seeing various sirim, various pots that are part of the sacrificial practice, and to the left of those, shovels and other implements, tools used in the sacrifices. Of course, the Mizbeach HaZahav was used for the offering of incense, of ketoret, but on the left-hand side, you're seeing, upper left quadrant, you're seeing the Mizbeach HaOlah, on which animals were sacrificed. And I believe that this is the kior just below it, and the kano, and the stand for the kior. Here's where, I'm sorry, I'm finishing my description of what you see here. But again, remember, there are almost 25 of these around hundreds of years later. This is what it says on the rubric that goes around. It says, Kol Ela b'hiyot heichal al mechonehu, no, al mechonato. All these, when the heichal, when the sanctuary was standing in its place. Umikdash hakadosh, I'm turning, al yisodeha, okay, and the holy mikdash was on its foundation. If you read from the side, Ashrei mi shera'a et yikar tiferet gdulato, right? Praised is the one who saw the splendor of its grandeur, right? V'chol ma'aseh tokpo ugvurato, and all of its strength, the work of its strength and its heroicness. Va'ashrei hamechakeh v'yagia lir'oto, and praised is the one who waits until he arrives at the moment of seeing it. Yihi ratzon, turning it sheyibaneh bimhera b'yameinu. Yir'u einenu v'yismach libenu, amen, amen, selah, right? Says, Yihi ratzon, may it be your will that it be built swiftly in our days. May our eyes see it, and may our hearts rejoice. Amen, amen, selah. Okay. What we already know from, I'm sorry, that took a little while. What we know from this is that clearly there was some kind of eschatological message in being able to see these images. Of course, the images, if they had appeared anywhere in the Tanakh, that you would have expected them to have appeared on the pages, because there are illuminated pages. You would have expected them to appear next to the biblical account of the Klei HaMishkan, the portable tabernacle, those implements, or in the context of Solomon, the building of Solomon's temple, where these are described, and yet they open the Tanakh or the Chumash itself, and this is a riddle. So, but as I said, it's clear that from a caption like this one, not all of them have such a rubric about awaiting the rebuilding of the temple, and may our eyes see it again quickly. But some don't have this, and some are called Mikdashya. They actually call the name of the text Mikdashya, which indicates that the text of the Tanakh is a portable sanctuary, is a small, like Mikdash Ma'at. And this is a name that is given to many of these texts. So there is the understanding of a connection between Torah and temple. Okay. I'm not going to read all these passages. I'm just going to mention, I'm starting with Ibn Ezra. And Ibn Ezra's dates are, sorry, I did write out for myself. Okay, Ibn Ezra's dates are 1089 to 1167. Ibn Ezra is the earliest is the earliest medieval thinker that I have come across who claims that there are correspondences between three parts of the cosmos, or three, yes, I'm going to say three parts of the cosmos. No, I don't like that. Three structures. One is the macrocosm, and it's called Olam Gadol, means macrocosm. One is Olam Katan, microcosm. So, and that is man. Man is the microcosm. And this comes from antiquity, right? And one is called the mesocosm, which means ha'olam ha'emtza'i. That's just what it means. So Ibn Ezra sets forth something which there are elements of this that we can find in Chazal, but not all three of them brought together. So the macrocosm is Olam HaShamayim, the celestial world, which includes the angels and the planets, and the mesocosm is the temple and its implements, and the human being is the microcosm. But one has to understand that they all correspond to one another. There's the great chain of being, going back to the Neoplatonism that I think I mentioned last time, maybe. Godliness it just comes through all these levels of existence, and their correspondences are extremely important. So I'm going to read just very briefly from the middle of the first line on page 5. V'gam hu amar ki shloshet olamot hem zeh ha'olam hu hagadol v'hamishkan emtza'i. Zeh ha'olam means ha'olam hashamayim, the celestial realm. V'hamishkan emtza'i v'ha'adam hakatan, and man is the small one. And then he's finding correspondences. Shamayim ba'olam, meaning in the macrocosm, we talk about the heavens. In the Mishkan, we talk about the Yuriot, the curtains. V'chein katuv notesh shamayim ki yiriyah, right? This is a lovely proof text. V'harosh ba'adam, and this corresponds to the head in man. And he goes on, and you can read about all these different correspondences, all the ways in which elements in the celestial realm, in the realm of the temple or the sanctum, Mishkan or Mikdash, correspond to one another, and as well to elements found within man himself. So we know already that there is this, Ibn Ezra, I would say, is fairly mainstream in this regard, but he's articulating it. What Ibn Ezra sets forth, and actually I did bring a second passage from Ibn Ezra, and this one has the English translation, but I gave you a longer translation in the English of the Hayot. This is from page 6, the top commentary on Exodus 25:40. V'hayodea sod nishmato umatkonet gufo yuchal lada'at divrei olam ha'elyon. Right, one who knows the secret, the mystery of his soul and the makeup of his body, can know matters of the highest world. Ki ha'adam kidmut olam katan, right? Because man is a microcosm, or is in the image of microcosm. V'hu haya sof briato ba'aretz, right? The last terrestrial being that was created is man. V'siman ladavar bagadol hechel uvakatan kala, right? And so God started with the greatest and ended with the smallest. And then he goes on to say, V'hagaon, and that's Sadya Gaon. He's kirki shmonasar dvarim heim b'mishkan. And Sadya Gaon, who's right, late 9th, early 10th century, he wrote that there are 18 things in the Mishkan, Shehu Olam Emtza'i, right, the mesocosm, the Mishkan, V'chamohem ba'olam ha'elyon v'kacha ha'olam ha'katan. Right. So this is an older tradition of the correspondences between the three realms. Okay. Once we get into, now I'm moving ahead. Once we get closer to the time of the codices that we're talking about, we see a big shift in attitudes toward matter, the material and the physical. We see this in Catalonia, and the person who really, I would say, kickstarts this in a big way is Ramban, is Nachmanides, Moshe ben Nachman, whose dates are 1194 to 1270. Towering leader and scholar. Ramban, in quite a few of his commentaries, makes the argument that the material objects, I shouldn't say quite a few of his commentaries, in his commentary on the book of Genesis and in Sha'ar HaGmul, a writing of his that pertains to the afterlife, that describes the afterlife. He says there in many different ways that the physical material objects found in the Garden of Eden and also in the Mishkan / Mikdash have their celestial counterparts, and that in truth they are one, but in our lifetimes we are unable to see the unity of the physical and the spiritual. Yet they are one, and it's really the material that gives humankind a conduit for apprehending the spiritual in some manner. He says that, the righteous in Eden will once again recapture this knowledge which was available to the residents of Eden prior to the expulsion from Eden. And there are other passages in Ramban which really express this, I'd say, appreciation of the material as a portal to the spiritual. This would have been anathema to Rambam, to Maimonides. Matter is not good, but Ramban really develops this, and we can see it subsequently in the writings of his students. So I brought you from Sha'ar HaGmul. This is the second to last reading on page 6. He says, Melechet HaKodesh v'Mishkan b'shlosha makomot. So even in the Mishkan, there are 3 regions, right? And we know this from Humash, right? Chatzer v'ohel v'lifnim min haparochet uvamikdash azara v'hechal. Azara v'hechal udvir. Okay, so I'll read it differently. Chatzer v'ohel v'lifnim min hakaporet. Okay, going from the outside to the inside, there's the courtyard, there's that which is behind the curtain, inside the curtain. There's the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed, and then there's that which is within the parochet, which is Kodesh HaKodashim. Okay, so there are these 3 regions. And then he describes, okay, Uvamikdash azara v'hechal udvir v'chol asher b'chol makom makom min hakelim v'tziurei hakruvim, and everything in each and every place of these vessels, v'tziurei hakruvim, right, the images of the cherubs, kulam lahavin sodot ma'aseh olam ha'elyon v'ha'emtzai v'hashafel, right? Every one of these physical material objects and the images of the kruvim as well, or tziurei hakruvim, they all enable us to understand. They don't say they enables us. They are to help us understand the mysteries of the work of the Olam Ha'elyon, the celestial world, Va'emtzai, the middle world, the mesocosm, Va'shafel. Okay, and the lowest one. I'm going to stop there. You see that Ramban has it out there. And then, again, for time reasons, which I have to be more sensitive to, we find that his student Rashba says really more of the same. I just will, and this is in his comment, the Rashba is wrote a commentary, Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, whose dates are 1235 to 1310. They're all from Catalonia, right? They're all Barcelona and from Gerona. He says he says the same thing, right? I'll just leave it there, right? I'll read from the English to do it faster. This is to say, whomever has de'ah, it is as if the temple was built in his days. And this is to say that he apprehends with his own knowing that which can be apprehended from the teachers of Torah and from Umitziurei HaMikdash. So we already know now that these images in the Catalan codices are being used for something, okay? Bachya ben Asher, another student, even later from the Nachmanidean circle, his dates are 1255 to 1340. He says the same thing and in an even more popular facing genre, namely a manual for sermonizers, right? Kad HaKemach is thematically arranged and says, has teachings from tradition about different topics. And under the topic Lulav, he says, right, Ure'e gam re'e ma'alat min ha'adam sheharei Hashem yitbarach tziva b'torato la'asot kelim gufaniyim b'mishkan uv'mikdash heyotam tziyurim v'dugma l'dvarim sichliyim sheba'olam ha'elyon. Okay, note how great is the human being for God, the blessed God, commanded in his Torah that these vessels be made physically, corporeally in the Mishkan and in the Mikdash. They are, what did I say here? Illustrations and exemplary, right? Heyotam tziyurim v'dugma, to matters that are purely intellectual / spiritual in the higher realm. God made it possible for humans to understand this so that God's Shekhinah could dwell among the lower beings. Okay, last thing I'm doing, then I'm zipping my lip. The strongest or the most frontal evidence of how these codices, how these frontispieces were used comes from Prophet Duran, and a very interesting figure whom I would love to speak more about another time. 1350 to 1415. I will tell you that he wrote this when he was an apostate. He was forcibly converted to Christianity in 1391, continued to write in Hebrew and even to write anti-Christian polemics in Hebrew. And he gives us tells us what to do, although he's using it a little bit differently. Okay, he builds up in this passage that I've selected for you the many parallels between the tripartite Tanakh, right, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and the tripartite Mishkan or Mikdash. And then he goes on to say, I just have to find where he actually tells you how to use it. Ooh. Gosh. I'm sorry. Oh gosh. Okay, v'chein. Oh dear. Well, I think you're gonna have to take my word for it. That he says, start by thinking about the three parts of the Tanakh, and then the three parts of the Tanakh are sitting there before you while you're looking at these implements. And then use this as a springboard for imagining something which once existed but doesn't any longer. Recall, he says, bring to your mind, recall the three parts of the temple, and then abstract further and think of these three, the way in which the cosmos, God's work, is divided into three. So he's actually telling the user how to use the illustrations themselves. The last thing I want to ask, and then is this prayer? Okay, and I realized that throughout the last lecture and this one, you may not always have been seeing what about the practices constitutes prayer. But if we remember that the desire to understand God better from our puny, frail, inadequate stances is the posture of the worshiper, then I think that you can see that this too, or I would argue this too, is an instance of prayer. So I will be quiet now and be very interested in hearing your comments and questions. Thank you.
Go ahead, Joel.
Hi. I was thinking of Lubavitch. I remember in junior high, the idea of tefillin, they would emphasize that, like many mitzvot, but especially tefillin. And they would say, what is above, so is below, and vice versa. And they would talk about, like, they really emphasize the idea how tefillin have to be kosher. If there's a mistake, some people would find this, very literal, fundamentalist, but their idea is it has to be exactly the divine copy in order to influence the above and the below. I remember reading this thing, the word phylactery in English, which is, Jews don't use that word too much. It has sort of a negative connotation, like it's in the New Testament, almost like the idea of an amulet, a superstitious amulet. And the idea of the icon is very similar, though. The saint's icon. It's very, very similar.
You're saying a lot of interesting things. So the first thing, I absolutely want to affirm and expand on what you said. I would say that Shneimur Zalman of the Yadi, the Alter Rebbe, the ideologue, the founder of Chabad, made very clear, and as do subsequent Chabad teachings, that the spiritual cannot exist without the material. That we must fully embody our carnality and physical mitzvot, the mitzvot ma'asiyot, that we have been commanded, because you need a vessel we humans, because of our frailty, we can't grasp the spiritual without having physical. So Chabad absolutely says exactly what I've just been talking about. It really expresses that very frontally and comprehensively. You are right. I think that the term phylactery, which which is related to our prophylactic, as in warding off something bad, that does turn it into something amuletic. I think there's a third thing that I wanted to get back to, but which I can't remember now. But Yehuda Halevi has a lot to say about the importance of the mitzvot ma'asiyot, the physical commandments, tzitzit, tefillin, mezuzah, sukkah, right? And he has a certain understanding that the divine presence really is accessible through these sites. But I think that he's different from Chabad and from what I've just described. Joel, the last thing you said I wanted to make a comment. Can you repeat, if you can, the last thing you said? Don't worry if you can't remember.
About the icons, the Catholic, Eastern Orthodox icons, even more so.
Yes, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you. It is widely assumed although I think I've just given an example to the contrary, that there is no such thing as, quote, material devotion practiced by Jews. Certainly the veneration of icons, because it's not called the worship of icons, it's called the veneration of icons, would be a terrific example, is a terrific example of using the material as a portal to the spiritual, or as a receptacle, regarding it as a receptacle from which the spiritual emanates. Most, as I understand it, and I hope to continue learning more, most practices of Christian material devotion, and I'm talking about medieval ones, are justified, legitimated with respect to the Christian theology of incarnation along these lines. If Jesus, who was God, took on corporeal being and became flesh, then we can understand that the spiritual can reside in the physical. And that became a justification for using physical objects as points of contact for the divine. Now, Jews, this is anathema to Jews. However, and this is something that I am writing about now, and it's a little cerebral, but that there was, I would argue, that some of the figures whom I've just mentioned, starting from Ibn Ezra through Ramban and Ramban's disciples, that they had a rather different understanding of the role of matter, right? Matter can sometimes be called etzem. It could be called geshem, right? Like gashmius, atzmus, right? Atzmut. But they had a different understanding of the role of matter in the cosmos, and it was not fully negative. So that's a different way of thinking about things. But thank you for your comments.
Hi, can I make a comment?
Hi, please.
How are you? Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was just thinking about the day after Yom Kippur and the avodah that you had mentioned last week. And it strikes me, actually, just I have many thoughts about it, but just very briefly, that the avodah, first of all, we actually, as you said, we actually reenact the service. It's one of the rare instances, maybe Hoshana Rabbah is the other one, which is also temple-centered, where we reenact something. But the focus on visual, with the end of it, Mari Cohen and Ashri Ayin Ra Takozo.
Absolutely.
We see ourselves as actually, in some sense, there, and then suddenly we realize that we're not there, and that's actually the traditional service, the really authentic one. That's when you say slichot, because slichot is the absence, and it leads right into it. Beautiful. And I think it's very interesting that the focus is on the Mikdash. I just would make one comment, which is that I think within the liturgy and the piyutim and everything, there's a tremendous focus on the relationship between the heavenly Jerusalem, or the celestial temple, and the human temple. And it goes back to Jacob having that vision where he sees the angels ascending, which is basically Kedusha, which is in the blessing, the third blessing, which is Jacob's blessing. And it strikes me that on Yom Kippur, in any event, it's very Mikdash centered. And in thinking about prayer and what prayer is about, and I mean, it's a big statement, but it strikes me that the idea of entering into this mythical world, that whether you want a temple or don't want a temple, but when you're in that space in your head, you're actually in that temple, and you actually do want the temple. But of course, when we finish praying and step back, maybe we don't want a temple or whatever, but the idea of entering into this mythical world, I think, is a very powerful idea, not just in terms of prayer. And I actually think that's for the American Jewish community in general, for the most part. I can't speak of some of the Haredi community, but for the Hasidic community, it's completely lost. The idea of Mulav Malka, that Jacob's actually there, that Elijah is actually there, that King David is there, is something completely foreign to the thinking of most Jews of various denominations. But I think in terms of prayer, it's a very interesting idea to think about. And as you say, the temple is this intermediate space between, I mean, there's a lot more thoughts, but just striking after Yom Kippur, think about the avodah. That, we realize the temple's not there, and then suddenly slichot, which is basically a prayer for the reconciliation of the relationship. So anyway, thank you very much for your,
thank
it's very thought-provoking. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And you shared several beautiful things. The one that I had not thought at all about was that why slichot come right after this mythical moment that we can't fully realize in our time. I've thought, well, so there, Mar'eh Kohen, that piyut is, I use the term, it's an academic term, ekphrasis or ekphrastic, which I defined as being creating with words an image so palpable that you are there. Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely ekphrastic, the Mar'eh Kohen piyut. And I absolutely agree with you. I mean, how could I not, about the power of entering into the myth. I'm thinking, and maybe you can help think about this, everybody, as well, the difference between reenactment, and which maybe is bound to result in disappointment, and contemplation where there's no nostalgia. Mm-hmm. I don't know if there what to say about that, but I think we all, I'm speaking for myself and maybe for some people listening, I think we all lament the paucity of myth in our lives, and I think that there's a reason why, among the reasons that Chabad does so well, is not only that they know how to market, but also that there's something that we crave and are hungry for. We do want to enter into these myths. I'll say one last thing. Some of you may know the children's book, Harold and the Purple Crayon. Sure. Yeah. So I think it's kind of it's a children's book that helps me articulate this phenomenon, which is that I might know that I'm drawing these images and then I jump into them. It's a curious bifurcated perspective. Yes, I know that it's my exertion that's making it come alive, but then I believe it with my whole heart.
Right. Could I just say one last, something I mentioned the other day, the story when Joseph is in Egypt and the brothers come down and he's going to eventually reveal himself. And prior to placing the goblet in Binyamin's sack, he asked them, how's your old father? Is he still alive? And they say, oh yes, he's still alive. And then you have the business with Benjamin, and then Judah speaks. And Joseph is very taken with Judah's speech. He says, I am Joseph. Ha'od avi chai, is my father alive? They had just told him just previously but that's the power of the story. The story is so powerful. How can he live without me? In other words, and I think is the power of the word and the power of the myth and the power of the story is that it transports us to a different place. And suddenly we can ask the same question we asked before. But now that you told me the story, is he still alive, really? I think that's right. It's interesting that the Mishnah, which is the source of the avodah, the Mishnah is actually 7 chapters, is a reenactment. It's written well after the temple is destroyed. Exactly. So the idea of reenacting is already deep in our tradition. The various poets who wrote pick up on that, but I think it's anyway. What to say? Anyway, thank you very much.
Right. That made. I mean, I guess I processed the Mishnah as nostalgia, but also, who knows whether there's not a vector pointing toward the last book of Rambam's Mishneh Torah. Like, this is what we're going to need to do when the time comes. But
one sees how one could take the Mishnah otherwise or move it in that direction. I agree with you, but yeah.
I'm sorry that I missed your own shiur. I hope I can maybe partake.
Probably online or something. Everything else.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there was one more thing. So Yehudit Barsky wrote in the Q&A, she asked, were some of these images used for meditation in the Jewish tradition?
Oh, I'm saying 100%. I'm saying 1,000%. They were, I guess I probably, because I fudged at the end, let me say it again. One was to look at these images, and then, which, we can process these pictorial images, and then use them as a springboard to catapult ourselves to thinking about the Mikdash, which doesn't exist anymore, right? But we're recalling it because it was a physical edifice with these very physical vessels in it. And then if you can get to that stage, which already entails some level of abstraction, then go higher up and imagine or attempt to bring into your mind the trifold or the tripartite structure that makes up the cosmos, which is God's creation, right? So it is, we would call it this is an exercise of visual contemplation, right? You start with what you can see, and then you work with it and try to bring yourself to a place of far greater spiritual content. So yes, meditation. Contemplation is a little different from meditation because meditation need not involve any kind of, in this case, visual, or even sometimes there's contemplation of words, right? People who have kavanot connected with Shema Yisrael, right? Those are other types of meditations on words, on phrases. And certainly once we talk about Kabbalah, there's a ton of them, and kavanot that are intended to make the act that we perform efficacious on high or within the realm of the sfirot. But we should recognize that I think there's much to be said about, I've said it already, the mitzvot ma'asiyot, the mitzvot that require our physical engagement, which tend to be the ones that I think even Jews who are not so observant, if they do anything, they tend to be the very physical ones. Those are the ones that stick with us. Anyway, I wish you all a Chag Sameach coming out, first Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. And when you sit in your sukkah, and I'm glad that Rabbi Silber spoke about the beating of the willows on Hoshana Rabbah. And I've thought a little bit about hakafot, and I can't figure out. Certainly, I think that because we think that we're circling Jerusalem or the temple, I think there's some element of reenactment there too, but I haven't investigated that closely. So Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Dr. Fishman, and thank you to everyone who is here for being part of our learning community. Next week on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. During Chol HaMoed, we will have one final offering for this month, exploring the end of Shemitah with Mr. Michael Fraud. Thank you. I've only seen it written so far. So this is meant to be a community discussion about the takeaways from this past Shemitah year that we might like to bring with us into the next 7-year cycle. So we really hope that you'll join us. And you can learn more about that at elul.drisha.org. And on behalf of everyone here at Drisha, we wish you a Gemar Chatima Tova and look forward to seeing you back here next week.
Maxine, I just wanted to mention that if elul.drisha.org, there's also one can still access the 6 podcasts we made for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, which is the world of, it's basically, I talk a bit about the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, but it's basically Hasidic music. The instrumental is playing Hasidic nigunim, which are probably many are not known to a lot of people. And some of them are quite stunning. So I highly recommend it. Okay, Chag Sameach.
I do too. It's really beautiful.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.